Dr. Simon Weaver had always thought of himself as a vacuum. Not the kind that sucked up dust from the corners of a house, but the kind that sucked up knowledge, theories, data, and equations. He was that kind of vacuum, the kind that took in everything, without ever being satisfied. It was this obsession with understanding the universe's most elusive, most terrifying phenomena that led him, quite literally, to the edge of everything. But that day changed everything. It was supposed to be just another experiment. One more test in a long series of failed attempts to harness the force of a black hole in a controlled environment. But instead, the universe decided to show Dr. Weaver that there were some forces even he could not predict. The lab was a mess. Cables draped across the floor like snake corpses, tools scattered on every surface, and the faint smell of burnt coffee lingered in the air. Simon stood in the middle of it all, wearing his usual look of frazzled brilliance. His white lab coat was half unbuttoned, sleeves rolled up past his elbows, and his wild, unkempt hair seemed to defy gravity all on its own. He was muttering to himself, staring intently at the shimmering containment field that housed the miniature black hole particle. "Today's the day," he whispered, eyes glinting with a mix of excitement and madness. "This will change everything." Beside him, his assistant Kate was less enthusiastic. She adjusted her glasses, looking at Simon with a mix of concern and disbelief. "Are you sure this is safe?" she asked, her voice strained. Simon waved her off. "Safe? Kate, we're on the brink of rewriting the laws of physics. There's no room for safety in innovation. You've seen the simulations, we're on the verge of a breakthrough. This will revolutionize energy production, space travel, hell, it could even change the course of human history." Kate bit her lip, glancing at the small device inside the containment field. A tiny, flickering orb of swirling darkness, no larger than a marble, hung in midair. It was a mini black hole, one that Simon had managed to create using a particle accelerator, a feat that most scientists thought was impossible. "I know, but," Kate hesitated, "it's alive. It's eating everything around it." "Not everything," Simon corrected her, his voice filled with an odd sort of reverence. "It's not eating anything, it's just consuming energy. Harnessing it." Simon's hands shook slightly as he adjusted the dials on the machine, a small bead of sweat trickling down his forehead. Kate stepped back, eyeing the orb warily. The experiment began with a faint hum, barely audible beneath the sound of Simon's breath. The black hole particle started to pulse, and Simon's heart rate quickened in sync with its rhythm. The energy readings spiked on the monitor in front of them, but Simon didn't take his eyes off the particle. He was too focused, too consumed by the potential that lay in front of him. Without warning, the containment field flickered and sputtered, its stability wavering for just a fraction of a second. In that moment, a strange magnetic pulse shot out from the black hole particle, not towards the machines, not towards the walls of the lab, but directly at Simon. Kate screamed, but Simon didn't have time to react. The pulse surged through his body, an overwhelming wave of energy that ripped through his flesh, sizzling across his skin. He stumbled back, his hands clutching at his chest, but the force was too great. His vision blurred as he felt the particle sink into him. There was a crackling noise, followed by a feeling of weightlessness, like his very soul had been pulled from his body. He fell to the ground, eyes wide, mouth open. He didn't scream. There was no pain. Just a sense of overwhelming change, like he was dissolving into the universe itself. "Simon." Kate's voice pierced through the haze, but Simon couldn't respond. He felt as if he were sinking through the floor, through the walls, through time itself, and then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. When Simon came to, he was no longer lying on the cold concrete of the lab floor. He was standing, disoriented, in the middle of a whirlpool of floating objects. His coffee mug, his clipboard, a few scattered pens, and, he noted with bemusement, a rubber chicken, all hovered around him, suspended in midair. Kate was standing at the far side of the room, staring at him in shock. What the hell is going on?" she gasped, eyes wide. What happened? Simon looked down at himself. He could feel it, something was inside him. He wasn't sure what it was, but it was there. It was like a pulse in his chest, a thrum of energy that was both alien and familiar. The air around him seemed to warp, like heat rising from the pavement on a summer day, and everything felt heavy. Or maybe light. He couldn't quite tell. Kate gasped again, but her words didn't seem to make sense. She was pointing at him, her mouth moving, but all he could hear was a low hum. "I'm fine," Simon muttered, his voice sounding oddly distant. He reached out, trying to steady himself, and that was when he realized the objects around him were floating because of him. He hadn't even touched them. He could just feel them, as though his body had become one with the space around him. He could manipulate gravity, time, it was as if he had become a black hole itself. The realization hit him with a rush of exhilaration. He had done it. He had achieved the impossible. "I did it," Simon whispered, his voice trembling with awe. "I am it." "What?" Kate demanded. "No. This is not possible. Simon, you've become the black hole." Simon's eyes widened as his mind raced. She was right. He hadn't just studied black holes, he had become one. His body felt strangely light. He could feel the pull of the gravity well inside him, something vast and hungry, a power that could bend the fabric of reality itself. But with that power came an unsettling sensation, something gnawing at the edges of his consciousness. The black hole wasn't just a thing he could control. It was something that was controlling him, too. His heart began to race. The energy inside him was growing, unstoppable. He could feel it in every fiber of his being. He had been so focused on the potential of the black hole, but now, in the quiet aftermath of his success, he realized the true cost. The thing inside him, the black hole engine, wasn't something he could simply command. It was a force. A force that would consume everything in its path, if he let it. "I'm fine," Simon muttered again, this time to himself. "I just need to think." Need to, but as the words left his mouth, the room around him began to distort. The objects in the air started to vibrate violently. Kate shouted something, but the words were lost in the static of the moment. Simon reached out instinctively, his hands pulling the floating objects back toward him, but something was off, his control was slipping. Kate was backing away, eyes wide with fear. "Simon, stop. But it was too late. A burst of energy exploded from him, sending everything flying across the room with the force of a small explosion. The glass on the windows shattered, the walls groaned under the strain, and the world around him began to collapse. Simon looked at his hands, at the glowing tendrils of black energy that now flickered beneath his skin. His heart skipped a beat. What had he done? Simon didn't know how much time had passed when the chaos finally subsided. The hum in the air was still there, but now it felt more like a pulse, steady, rhythmic, like a heartbeat. He was still standing in the middle of his lab, but the room had changed. The walls were cracked, the windows were shattered, and the shelves had buckled under the weight of whatever gravitational force he had unleashed. Floating pieces of equipment drifted lazily around him, some spinning in slow, erratic circles that he could feel the pull inside him. Not just in his chest, but in his very bones, like a hunger that was growing stronger with each passing second. The black hole particle wasn't just inside him, it was becoming him. "Kate," Simon said, his voice sounding distant, almost foreign. He turned slowly to look at her, his eyes narrowing as he saw the fear in her expression. Kate was still standing by the door, her face pale, her hands clutching the doorframe for support. "What did you do?" she whispered, her voice shaking. "Simon, this isn't you." Simon opened his mouth to speak, but the words didn't come out the way he expected. Instead, he felt a pressure behind his eyes, a sort of mental strain. His vision blurred, and for a moment, it was as if he could see the entire world in a single moment, a stretched-out, warped image, like a reflection in a funhouse mirror. The black hole energy within him seemed to ripple, distorting the space around him. It was as if the universe itself was bending to his will. And yet, he couldn't control it. "I didn't do anything," he said, his voice suddenly hollow. "It did this, to me." His hands twitched. He tried to focus, but his mind was still caught in that strange, vast space, the place where he could feel everything around him, and yet, nothing truly made sense anymore. He could hear the hum of the universe itself, like a distant song playing just out of reach. He felt it inside him, this hunger, this pull toward something greater, something beyond anything he had ever understood. The sound of Kate's footsteps broke through his reverie. She was moving toward him, cautiously, still unsure, but determined. She stopped a few feet away, her eyes scanning him with growing dread. "Simon," she said softly, almost as if speaking to a child. "Listen to me. You have to fight it. You need to find a way to stop this before it's too late. She hesitated. "You're not just a person anymore. You're something else." Simon didn't respond right away. His gaze drifted to his hands again. He could see the dark energy curling just beneath his skin, like smoke swirling in the air. The black hole inside him was no longer a foreign object, it had become an integral part of his being, like a parasite that was feeding on him from the inside out. But there was something more. As the seconds passed, Simon could feel it, he could feel the world around him slipping. It wasn't just the lab, the objects floating around him, or even the warping of space. It was his mind. His thoughts were becoming fragmented. He couldn't focus. He couldn't hold on to a single thought for more than a few moments before another one would take its place, each more urgent, more pressing than the last. "I can feel it," he said, his voice quiet now. It's inside me. It's trying to take me." Kate didn't respond at first. Instead, she took a careful step forward, her hand outstretched, as though trying to reach him, to ground him. "Then fight it," she urged. "You have to fight it, Simon. You're still in there. You can still fight it. You're not just a black hole." Simon's head snapped up, and for a brief moment, his eyes focused on hers. But something in his gaze had changed. There was a flicker of recognition, followed by an unsettling blankness, as though the man she had once known had already slipped away, leaving only the shadows of who he had been. "I can't fight it," he whispered. The words barely made it out of his mouth. "It's too strong. It's not just inside me. It's taking me apart." The lab's hum intensified. Objects around him vibrated, caught in the pull of the growing gravitational field. Kate's eyes widened, and she took another step back. "Simon, please," she said, her voice trembling. "You don't have to do this. There's always a way out. There has to be. We just need to figure it out together." Simon shook his head slowly, a strange, sorrowful smile tugging at his lips. "You don't get it, Kate. It's too late." Before she could speak again, a loud, sharp sound filled the room, the crackling of glass breaking, followed by a rush of wind as the very air around Simon seemed to warp and twist. He barely noticed, his mind slipping further away, swallowed by the black hole growing inside him. Then it happened. Kate cried out as she stumbled backward, her feet skidding across the floor as the lab's walls and ceiling seemed to bend and collapse inward. It wasn't just the objects floating or the strange energy, everything around them was folding in on itself, as though the very fabric of space was unraveling. Simon's hands shot out instinctively, but not with the intent to stop it, he was just responding. The black hole inside him was drawing everything into its gravitational pull, pulling the lab, the entire building, everything around him, toward its singularity. Kate was no longer screaming. She was simply frozen, watching in disbelief as the walls crumbled. The ground beneath them began to shift, and Simon felt it, a tugging at his chest, pulling him toward the center of the event. The black hole wasn't just inside him anymore, it was consuming everything around him. He was going to be lost in it, Kate, Simon murmured, his voice barely a whisper. I'm sorry. Then, without warning, he collapsed to his knees, his entire body trembling as the pull of the black hole grew stronger. He could feel the darkness wrapping around his soul, pulling him deeper, farther from the person he had once been. The sensation of time itself stretching and collapsing became too much. His vision blurred again, and for the briefest moment, he thought he saw the world through a new set of eyes, eyes that were both his and not his at all, but in that moment of perfect clarity, Simon understood. He wasn't just fighting the black hole. He was becoming it. It was too late to stop it now. He couldn't stop it. He had crossed a line he couldn't uncross. In one final act of desperation, he reached out and touched Kate's hand, feeling her warmth, her humanity, for the last time. I'm sorry, he repeated, his voice barely a whisper. The pull of the black hole intensified, and in the next instant, the world around him collapsed into a singularity of light, sound, and energy. There was nothing left. In the aftermath of the implosion, the world seemed to stand still. The chaos, the destruction, all of it had folded into itself. There was nothing left of the lab, the building, or the city that had stood at its edge. The place where Simon Weaver had once stood, an embodiment of human curiosity and ambition, was gone, swallowed by the black hole that had become a part of him. But for Kate, standing outside the collapse, there was no instant relief. Her mind raced, grasping for an explanation, for any shred of hope that Simon might still be somewhere inside the catastrophe he had caused. The air around her buzzed with a low hum, a reverberation of the energy that had surged moments before. It felt wrong, like a heavy weight pressing down on her chest. She had been forced to watch it all, helpless, as Simon had surrendered to the darkness inside him. There had been no way to stop it, no way to reach him in time. She could still hear his voice, the broken apology that had slipped through his lips in his final moments. I'm sorry. It was a hollow phrase, a last flicker of humanity before the universe swallowed him whole. Kate stood frozen in the middle of what used to be a bustling street, debris and dust swirling around her. There were no screams anymore, no sirens. Just the unnatural silence of a world that had been torn apart. The force had dissipated, but the gravity, literal and figurative, of what had happened remained. But what now? Kate had spent years under Simon's tutelage, following him through every insane theory and dangerous experiment. He had always been the one with the answers, the one who could predict the future, who could see the patterns in the universe. And now? Now, he was gone. Or at least, the man she had known was, but she knew there had to be something left. Something she could do. Maybe it's not too late. Her fingers shook as she pulled out her phone, typing a quick message to her colleagues at the university, asking for help. She couldn't stay here, not now, not with everything crumbling around her. But her mind was already somewhere else, on Simon. On the black hole that had consumed him. Could she reverse it? Was there a way to stop the force he had unleashed before it swallowed the rest of the world? The thought was both absurd and desperate. She didn't even know where to begin. But she had to try. The next few days were a blur. She spent most of her time in front of monitors, poring over data from the lab's servers. She managed to access the backup files from Simon's experiments, though they were far from complete. The notes were disjointed, his usual neat handwriting scribbled with erratic lines and nonsensical equations as though he had been losing his grip on reality. But it was the pattern, the underlying thread, that she focused on. The black hole. She wasn't entirely sure of what it was, not in the way Simon had understood it. It wasn't just a mini black hole particle. It had become something else, something sentient, something alive. It had become a part of Simon, a parasite that had taken root in his mind and his body. But Kate wasn't ready to believe that Simon was truly gone. She couldn't be. The way he had looked at her in the final moments, there had been something there. A spark. He had fought it. Even as the black hole consumed him, there had been something of the man left. That was her hope, the only hope she had left. days blurred into weeks as Kate continued to pore over Simon's work, reaching out to colleagues, trying to make sense of it all. She visited the remnants of the lab, now little more than a crater in the ground. The smell of burnt metal still lingered in the air, and the hum of static electricity was a constant, like the ghost of something unfinished. The black hole, though it no longer had a physical form, lingered in her thoughts. She could feel it, like a presence watching her from the edges of her mind. She wasn't alone in this. The government had taken over the investigation, but Kate had insisted on staying close, offering her expertise. The black hole particle was a phenomenon that no one had been prepared for, least of all the scientists who had worked with it. She knew that if they were going to understand it, to contain it before it spread any further, she would have to be the one to do it. Simon would have wanted her to, but there was no roadmap for this. She couldn't just reverse time or undo what had happened. The black hole was too powerful. It had rewritten the laws of physics around itself. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized that maybe the answer wasn't in controlling the black hole. Maybe the answer was in controlling the thing that had become a part of it. Simon. She could feel him in the back of her mind now. Every time she looked at the data, every time she thought of him, she could almost hear his voice, muffled but insistent. It was like he was still there, somewhere in the event horizon, caught in a loop of time and space that he couldn't escape. The truth hit her like a cold slap. What if Simon wasn't gone? What if he had been absorbed by the black hole? Yes, but what if the black hole hadn't just consumed him in the way they thought? What if it had taken him and merged him with the singularity? Kate's breath caught in her throat as the idea took hold. The black hole didn't just destroy. It transformed. It could bend and warp space, but it didn't necessarily erase everything that entered it. Maybe Simon's consciousness, his mind, was still inside that black hole. Maybe it could still be saved. She didn't know how to prove it, but she knew she had to try. The thought was wild, impossible, but after everything she had seen, after everything that had happened, what other choice did she have? She was standing in front of a large computer screen at the university, surrounded by dozens of readouts and simulations. The black hole had been contained in a temporary energy field, one designed to keep it from expanding beyond a certain radius. But Kate knew that this was only a temporary measure. She had no illusions that they could keep it contained forever. She needed a way to tap into it, to pull Simon out before it was too late. The equations on the screen swirled in front of her like a puzzle she couldn't quite solve. There was no simple fix, no easy way out. But there was one thing she could try. The black hole's gravitational field was strong, yes, but it was also delicate. If she could find the right frequency, if she could sync her own consciousness with the singularity, Kate's fingers flew over the keyboard, her heart racing. She didn't know if this would work, didn't know if Simon could even hear her through the darkness that had consumed him. But she had no other option. She had to reach him. The screen in front of her blinked, then froze. A new window popped up, displaying a single line of code: gravitational pulse detected. Kate's breath caught in her throat. It was working. She hit the enter key, and the lab around her seemed to hum. The gravitational field around the black hole pulsed with energy, and Kate's body seemed to resonate with it. She could feel the presence inside the singularity now, not Simon entirely, but something. A flicker of consciousness. A spark. "Simon," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Are you there?" The hum around her grew louder, and for a moment, the world went black. It was in that moment, when the universe seemed to collapse into itself, when the walls of space and time bent in on her, that Kate heard it. The whisper. The voice. Kate. It was Simon's voice.